Uh, my name is Pedro Mizukami. My background is in law, but as I mentioned yesterday in several parallel conversations, I try not to do legal research. Incidentally, do legal research because I have to justify my position at the law school. But we mostly we're concerned with problems that are derived from the legal environment, but analyzing them not exactly through the lens of traditional legal scholarship or legal discourse. So, shadow libraries, using brackets in Rio de Janeiro universities. I could add several additional brackets there because it's in Rio de Janeiro universities with 3 specific disciplinary fields and so on, with other layers that they can use to qualify that. But the name of the actual project that I'm involved in, it's called the College of Access to Educational Materials in Developing World Universities. Shadow Libraries is sort of our pet name for it. We still don't know if we're going to stick with it or if we're going to revert to a College of Access or if we're going to use the College of Access to Educational Materials in Developing World Universities, which is kind of clumsy to say, but it actually describes what we're looking into. Is anyone familiar with the Media Piracy in Emerging Economies study? Has anyone not read it or haven't heard about it? The CPP pricing study was part of Maria's slides today, and it's actually the portion of the research that we're most famous for. I mean, that's the one that got the most media coverage. It's the numeric hook for the news coverage that we had. But there's actually lots of interesting research that was done, more qualitative in nature, across 5 or 6 different countries that's worth checking out if you haven't. So I was part of the Brazilian team. We also had teams in India, South Africa, Russia, smaller studies in Mexico and Bolivia, and the Shadow Libraries, or a College of Access project, is sort of a continuation of the media piracy study. So we're taking an approach which is narrower to a degree because we're just focusing on educational materials. We're focusing on sharing between students in universities. But it's broader in the sense that we're not exactly looking into piracy. I mean, piracy is pretty much still part of what we're looking into, but we're more interested in understanding exactly how students are behaving towards the material that they have to read or that they use for their research during their years in university. So when you mention something like a shadow library, the most immediate thing that comes to mind, something like BookZZ or Bookza or BookOS. Are you all users of BookOS? They sort of do an amazing job for the academic community across the world, and of course they are mostly pirate. I can also mention LibGen, library.nu, rest in peace. And there's a good piece in the forthcoming report by Bodo Balas about the origins of library.nu and BookZZ, which is going to be worth checking out. We can also think of something about like ARG, depending on your field of research. You're probably very well acquainted with ARG. And we can also think about private torrent trackers, of which there are a few. This is mainly the only one that I'm actually a member of currently. I've been kicked out of a few for different reasons, which is sort of one of the interesting things about these communities. There are rules to be followed. I was kicked out of one private tracker because of inactivity, meaning I wasn't downloading or uploading anything. Some trackers have more loose rules regarding activity. So I can probably collect several accounts for different trackers, even if you do not use them. But for several of those, you actually have to be a participant and an active member of the community in order to remain in the community. So that's the immediate image of a shadow library for books or educational materials that comes to mind. But we're not exactly looking only into those. We're actually examining more less structured practices of sharing among students. We actually came into the study with the expectation that local realities in these different countries would reflect these large English language, mostly English language archives and collections and libraries of pirate material, but this happened not to be the case, at least in Brazil. We'll see different realities across the different countries that we study. Argentina is in stark contrast to Brazil because the Argentina study is a case study about a specific library of academic materials in the University of Buenos Aires called Bibliofil. The students themselves organized a library of materials mostly related to philosophy and the humanities in general. And we rarely see that in Brazil. If I can draw a conclusion from what we studied, is that these libraries that we are studying are mostly very ad hoc, very precarious in nature. They born and die very quickly, and they're mostly dedicated to specific courses or tied to specific classes of students or specific professors, and they rarely jump from that more precarious level to a more structured and organized community, such as what happened in Argentina. And also different to what happens in South Africa, for example, when some students organize private direct connect servers and share the materials for their courses through that server. So at least in the communities, in the academic communities that we studied, we did not observe very well structured, organized practices of curating, archiving, and making content available in the form of a library. So what is the project all about? I mean, we are all collecting data that is both qualitative and quantitative in nature. I mean, the qualitative data is mostly interviews with informants from universities, and by that I mean professors, librarians, people in administrative positions, people from the government. So we've been talking with the Minister of Culture, with officials that are involved with open access policies, with the publishing industry, and that also encompasses the university presses, with educational content startups, which is probably going to be an interesting parenthesis to our report. We're also done focus groups with undergraduate students from 3 disciplinary fields. So we're talking about law students, medicine, and communication students. So why did we pick 3 different disciplinary fields? We thought that we should at least take into account different practices across different fields in terms of the type of material that is usually prescribed for students. So in law, for example, in Brazil at least, lots of textbooks that relate to specific disciplines, such as, for instance, civil law or criminal law, and a student is supposed to purchase 1 or 2 of these textbooks, which they will use for the entire course. Maybe several different volumes, for criminal law, 1, 2, or 3, or 4, or 5 different volumes, and very much different with what happens in communication. More book chapters or smaller monographic works, and different for medicine as well. Lots of papers, lots of video material for medicine also. So these different practices, we try to take that into account by looking into different fields and students from different fields. All of us, all of the members, all of the participants looked into law and communication, but there was a variance in terms of people looking into either medicine or engineering, I think. We're still analyzing the data, and we're still just assembling the report. So this is a warning that I'm going to repeat later, but that I should bring up right now, is that everything that I'm going to talk about is preliminary. So we're just finishing the study. As for quantitative data, we did a survey with undergraduate students from the same fields, with a questionnaire that relates to access, sharing, collection of educational materials. So these are the countries that carried out a survey. So the US has a survey, India, Poland, South Africa, and Brazil. I'm forgetting about Argentina. Argentina also has a survey. Not all of the countries, not all of the participant countries actually carried out a survey. And we also approached the survey through different lenses. Some of these are more like case studies related to a specific community, as for example happens with Argentina, which is a specific department within the University of Buenos Aires. And we tried with Brazil to at least get a statistically representative sample of a population, which I'm going to be more clear later, but I can already anticipate is the population of students from these 3 courses in the city of Rio de Janeiro. So there's a variance in terms of approaches and also in terms of how comparable these data are. So this is also a warning. Before I get into the, I'm going to highlight some of the results that we got from the survey. I should also warn you that I'm not going to speak about our analysis of the qualitative data that we collected. We're still going over something like more than 30 hours of interviews, which is a lot to parse. And so we don't have results from those interviews yet. And we're also still looking into the survey results. In fact, we're still collecting data. So before I delve into that, some context on Brazil. So what is a legal copy in Brazil? Well, we talked about fair use yesterday, about India, what's allowed to be copied in India. So what is allowed, what are students and professors or anyone is allowed to copy in Brazil? So if a content is still under copyright, we have Article 46 of the copyright law, which has a list of exceptions and limitations. So this is not similar to the fair use system, which is more open and allows for greater judicial interpretation and construction about what would be considered fair use. Exceptions and limitations are much more narrow, and this is a system that is adopted mainly by the systems that are derived from the continental European law tradition. So Brazil imported that approach to copyright exceptions. So we have Article 46 of the law that comes with a set of like 15 or 16, I'm probably getting the number wrong, very narrow limitations. The rationale for the limitations is also not clear. By reading the law, you cannot extract a clear meaning of why should we have exceptions or limitations. In fact, it's not clear why we should have copyright to begin with. I mean, of course, we can infer by reading the law that it's there for the protection of authors, quote unquote. But if you look into the Constitution, you're not going to see a clear rationale for copyright. If you look into the American Constitution, you're going to read the clause, the copyright clause for the progress of arts and sciences. You're not going to read that into the Brazilian Constitution. You see something similar for the patent clause, which has a justification for patents. But there is no justification for copyright. Copyright is simply there. So in order to extract an interpretation for the meaning of copyright law or the functions of copyright law, even if you look at the Constitution, you have to go an extra mile to actually pick several different provisions from the Constitution and construct some meaning for why we should have copyright protection to begin with. And this is even harder. Wow, I have 5 minutes left. Okay. So this is even harder for limitations. So if there's really no clear reason for copyright, there's even a less clear reason for limitations. So if you think of educational uses, of non-commercial uses, these are very ingrained thoughts that we have when we try to justify our practices when we are accused of copyright infringement. But those are not criteria that are used by the law itself to determine the exceptions and limitations. So they're kind of scattershot. They're like thrown in the legislation. You don't have a clear idea where they came from. Some of them came from international law. Some of them came through the years of development of the legislation in Brazil. The 1998 law is not the first copyright law that we had. We also had a law in 1973, Previous to that, we had the Civil Code of 1916. Prior to the Civil Code of 1916, we had another law called Law of Medeiros and Albuquerque. And through each of these laws, I mean, if you start from Medeiros and Albuquerque, there's a blueprint for the limitations and exceptions article. And if you analyze it, if you compare it to the Civil Code of 16, to the law of 1973, and to the law of 1998, you see a gradual restriction on what is considered to be an exception limitation. So user rights have progressively diminished across the years in Brazil. So in 1973, between 1973 and 1998, if you would like to copy, for instance, a book in a university copy shop for your personal use, that would be perfectly legal. Not so after 1998. So Article 46.2 allows reproduction of like small excerpts of books or articles or anything that's copyrightable for personal use only, in a single copy, made by the copyist, him or herself. So there's like several restrictions on what is considered a legal copy, at least in the context of everyday educational uses. So this brings up several questions. I mean, what is exactly a small excerpt? I mean, no one knows what a small excerpt is. There's really no legal criterion for what would be considered a legal copy. So by default, if you look into the rights holder organizations, so this is ABDR. This is the Association of Brazilian Association of Reproduction Rights, Reprographic Rights. I'm sorry. This was set up to be an RRO, which is a reproduction rights organization, which would do something like collective license of copyright for reprography. You say that you can see written in Portuguese, cópia autorizada, não autorizada é crime. Unauthorized copies are a crime. It doesn't really say what exactly is a non-authorized copy. You get the impression that any copy is non-authorized if you don't have the permission to do it. And this is actually the interpretation that they adopt. If you look into copyright notices in books, you'll see that not a single excerpt, not a copy of single excerpt is allowed by any means or any formats. And some librarians take those notices seriously. If you think about it, if you give an interpretation through Brazilian consumer law, those notices would be illegal because we do have a right to copy small excerpts, regardless of the fact that we do not know what a small excerpt is. I cannot simply flat out state in a copyright notice that I cannot copy anything in a book, but that's what they do. So I'm going to skip what happened during the past decade with ABDR and the crackdown on university copy shops, because this is pretty much in the background of our research. We are trying to understand what is going on with the widespread adoption of digital technologies and file sharing and digital copies in general. Is that affecting in any way the culture of photocopies that we have? What are the consequences for policy analysis? What is exactly going on? So that's where the survey comes in, and I'm going to give you some preliminary results. So I'm going to skip the more technical details about the sample. So I'll leave this slide on for like 2 seconds, 1, 2. And things to bear in mind when looking into the data. So Brazil is a big country. Access to the internet or the availability of bookstores and libraries varies a lot between regions, states, and cities. If you were here for Fabio's presentation yesterday, he had very nice maps about the distribution of libraries and bookstores. And if you live, for example, in countryside São Paulo, you probably live in a city that does not have a library. I mean, that could be the case. I grew up in a city that had a single library, and it was a university town. 3 universities, only a single library. So access to the legal means of acquiring books, I mean, is severely limited. Not necessarily so in Rio de Janeiro, which is where we collect the data. So that's something to consider. Rio de Janeiro is a capital city. It's located in one of the most wealthy states of Brazil, which is Rio. So that's another thing that you should bear in mind. This is only part of the sample, so it covers only 1,900 of the students we are surveying. There's still like like 400 students that we need to survey. We are actually doing that as I speak, and those are mostly law students. So whatever results I show you might change a little. And this is only part of the questionnaire. We have like 60 questions. I extracted like 20 or so, and I'm going to run over them very quickly. And we're also interpreting the results and trying to think about how to present and visualize these data. So we start out with several questions regarding access to educational materials. How do you, a student, acquire educational materials? So this is based on student impressions, so that must be stressed. They were asked about only their previous semester in whatever course they're currently enrolled. This relates to means of access to educational materials, and we asked about how much of your educational materials you actually purchase new at the store, how much you purchase secondhand, used, how much you photocopy, how much you download from sources you believe to be pirate. And this is interesting because there are questions that allow us to explicitly derive conclusions about copyright awareness, but these two questions allow us to interpret or at least get an idea about copyright awareness among students in an implicit way. So sources you believe to be legal or illegal, they're not necessarily sources that are legal or illegal. And how much material you copy from your classmates. We also asked students for estimates on prices for materials they purchased, new or used, or photocopies they took. We are still pretty much interested in pricing and how pricing acts as an access to barrier access to the acquisition of materials. So we're going to do something similar to what we did with the comparative prices with these data that we are extracting, and also with actual market data on prices of textbooks and books that are actually prescribed in courses we are serving. Reasons for why they decide to purchase materials new or secondhand. Reasons for why they download pirated materials, and what sources they consider sources of pirate content or not. I mean, we asked for legal and illegal content. So I'm going to go over several of these very quickly, but we started with a question asking them what's your main mode of acquisition for the educational materials that you use in your everyday life? Do you purchase them new, like 28%? Do you photocopy 36%? Download from the internet, 27%, purchase secondhand 5%, or borrow from the library 4%. We also have other answers that we still have not classified, but this is basically what it looks like currently. So photocopy culture, mostly still the main way through which students acquire their materials in Brazilian, at least in Rio de Janeiro, schools of communication law and medicine. And then we ask about percentages. So these are very rough, and if you add them all, of course, they're not going to add to 100% for each individual student surveyed, but we want to understand, like a very rough impression of the students of how much material they acquire, new, used, etc. So like 26% acquire 81% or 100% of the materials new, 19% do not acquire any new stuff. And then you have the spectrum between. What's interesting, more than half of our surveyed students claim not to buy materials secondhand. This is something that surprised me because I actually do acquire lots of materials secondhand, and increasingly do so after the internet, because it's very easy to just search for books that are either out of print or still in print, but you can acquire for on the cheap through secondhand bookstores. We have some theories of why this happened here. At least for the law students, it's very easy to understand because they are very concerned about how up-to-date their material is. Laws could change monthly. Brazilian law textbooks have new editions yearly, and those editions are not really are not done for the purpose of forcing students to buy new editions, but they exist because, in fact, law changes. So it's not gratuitous. It's not exclusively profit-driven. There's a reason for content to be updated. But that wouldn't explain the behavior of, say, communication students. So we're still looking into that. So how much do you photocopy? Right? If you get the range from 41 to 100, you can see that previous number of like 36% of students claim that their main mode of acquisition is still photocopies. We still have very heavy photocopy culture. Now things get more interesting and controversial because, I mean, what exactly is a pirate source and what exactly is a legal source? And predictably, you also have a drop in the number of respondents because people are, of course, concerned about answering questions that directly ask them if they're doing illegal activity. We tried to account for that with a questionnaire that was very friendly and not confrontational, but still we had a drop in responses here. Not substantial enough to make the results unusable, but even so, that happened. And that happened here too. Sources you believe to be legal, around the same percentage, like 6% of students did not answer this question. This is much more interesting for the reasons that they stated when they were surveyed than for the percentages. And I hope to get into that if I have time. The percent of digital copies that you got from your classmates. And copyright awareness. So we have a few explicit questions about copyright awareness. This is very interesting. So how much of a book can you photocopy for educational purposes? So I don't know, 69%, which is a very honest answer, and it's probably accurate. If you ask anyone in any Brazilian university how much you can copy of a content of a specific book, if that person is honest, and that's probably the answer that you should have. But then you can copy everything. You can copy nothing. You can copy small excerpts. You can copy one chapter. You can copy 10%. And you have like this variety of answers here. And the other replies, the open replies that we got were also very interesting. You have people claim, oh, it's 3%, it's 7%, it's 6%, it's less than half. So that reflects the lack of criteria that we have for determining what exactly you can copy. Mostly you don't know. Because you don't know, you really don't know what a small excerpt is. When there was a crackdown in the middle of last decade, a few universities that had a strong position and were able to fight back actually published internal rules determining what would be considered a legal copy. So some of those universities decided that, well, a legal copy is going to be one chapter of a book. It's going to be one academic paper. It's going to be 5% or 10%. So we have these internal rules that run parallel to copyright law. I mean, these are mostly, if you think about them, they might be illegal because, I mean, there's really no way that I can say that I can copy 10% of a book if I interpret the law exclusively. If I look into the Constitution and I'm going to have to develop a lengthy constitutional argument justifying why I would be allowed to copy 10% or 50% of a book, or the full book for that matter. But these universities have done that to defend themselves against copyright enforcement actions. And if the universities came to the point of actually instituting these rules, they were strong enough to enforce their own rules. So these cases are not usually taken to court, at least for the big universities. For the smaller ones, that's another question. So you have to have a strong position in order to be able to assert your own rules and say, well, this is what's going to be legal in my university. Another question related to copyright awareness: do you consider copying files with educational content from your classmates legal or illegal? So 80% claim to be totally legal. So if I get it from a hard drive or a USB stick, like a collection of books, well, that's perfectly legal. It's illegal, plain illegal 13%, and it depends which is the correct answer. It could be legal, it could be illegal, I don't know. It could be public domain work. That's the correct answer that you would get from a copyright scholar. But mostly people think this is legal behavior. So I'm so we also mapped student sharing practices and professor-student sharing practices. So we asked them to. They could answer as many as they wanted. So do professors usually share content with you through email, Facebook groups, Dropbox? ForShared is a I don't know if you use ForShared. I mean, it's mostly, it's not a Brazilian platform, but it's mostly adopted by Brazilians. It's kind of like Mega, and it's a CyberLocker. It's an online storage site, but like Dropbox, but we separated that because it really has a wide adoption in Brazil. Google Docs, Script, blogs, USB sticks, so we accounted for the sneakernet through that category, and other services are too. So mostly sharing is done through email and to a lesser degree Facebook groups. So what we get from this, this is really not conducive to an environment where libraries of materials can be constructed. So if mostly professors share with students through email, and if students also share mostly through email amongst themselves, these are not practices that are really set up an environment for something like what happened in the University of Buenos Aires to take place. Facebook groups also very popular, mostly with students, so these are mostly student organized, and these probably map out to specific courses or specific classes of students. They keep a Facebook group for the entire semester, for the entire period they're going to be in law school or med school, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting about that 6.1% there, other services or tools, is that it's mostly WhatsApp. So what happens is students take pictures of their books and they just send it to their students, to their other classmates through a WhatsApp group. So what do you take from this? I mean, if you think about it, what's the major Brazilian shadow library, or the major South African, or the major Indian shadow library for that matter? If you really look into it, it's mostly Google, Dropbox, and Facebook. And that's something that raises lots of interesting questions. And finally, we also map access to other media. We ask about what kind of content do you share with your classmates? And we ask specific questions about music, video games, productivity software, films and TV shows. And I'm not going to go over each one of these, but I can summarize what these tells us. Peer-to-peer networks are pretty much a niche thing, as someone could reasonably suspect, at least among these students, higher than we expected. Like 32% claim to use peer-to-peer networks. But online streaming, for films and for music, I mean, the most answers that we got were from streaming. So, and streaming does not mean necessarily legal streaming. So I got these screen caps of these. This is Shudar. So sites like this, like Filmes Online Gratis, which it translates to free online movies. This is a pirate streaming website. I actually went into one of these sites at the hotel. Gabriel couldn't get into, I don't know what site he was trying to access, but this was not filtered. And so I could, if I wanted to, I could just watch Furious 7 dubbed into Portuguese through a streaming cam copy yesterday, if I wanted to. Actually, a good cam copy, this one. And I can also download this if I want to. So streaming means not only Netflix, though we kind of suspect that it mostly means Netflix, but it also means popcorn time, and it also means sites like this. And for video games and productivity software, other interesting stuff, but since I'm way over time, I'm not going to go into those. So if anyone is curious about the data, I have the full data set here with me. If you want to look into any of the other 60 questions that we asked and talk about what we got and help us interpret this, I'm going to be here and can be reached through email or Twitter. Thank you.
The paper that I'm going to give today derives from this chapter that I've just written for this collection, Hollywood and the Law. I've written in that a kind of historical account of Hollywood's engagements with piracy and battles against piracy. I'm not going to give you that history, but more a paper which kind of reflects upon the historiographic implications of trying to research piracy. And the point I want to start from is by saying that histories of Hollywood have almost entirely been preoccupied by telling the story of the legally authorized sphere of production, distribution, and exhibition. Yet from the very earliest years of film in the US, producers, distributors of moving images have continually alleged that the properties in which they claimed ownership have been used in a multiplicity of ways without their authorization. So I think we have to accept that therefore piracy has been a persistent and endemic component of Hollywood history. With the recent boom of critical media scholarship that's been around concerning piracy, and a lot of it's in this room, of course, today, the focus has been very much upon the contemporary digital era. Now, I think this work is extremely valuable, for it demonstrates how the meanings and the definitions of piracy are somewhat multiple and contingent. Yet what seems to be missing from this work is any perspective on how the meaning and practices of piracy have changed over time. And in this respect, I'm kind of mindful of a quote that comes from Lawrence Lang. He appears in the second version of the Steal This Film documentaries, where he says, people like to see the contemporary and the digital era as some kind of unique break. And I think the important point to make here is not to see it as a unique break, but really to see it as a moment that accelerates things which have already happened in the past. I'll also bring in a comment that, talking to Maria earlier on, who has made reference to history here today, she talked about how the history kind of de-dramatizes the digital, and I think that's a really kind of good point to take forward. So the paper I'm offering here, my interests are twofold. First of all, I'm concerned with how the persistence of piracy constitutes what I call a shadow history of Hollywood and of moving images more generally. And then secondly, I'm concerned with how piracy resists the methodological practices of historical research in ways that I would say challenge the very possibility of constructing authoritative media historiography. So the paper is not attempting to provide a history of piracy, but rather what I'm going to do is offer 5 very brief notes about the impact of piracy on Hollywood historiography. To give the points a kind of point of focus, what I'm going to do is concentrate on the 1975 trial of budget films, which is a landmark case because for the first time criminal charges were brought in the US against individuals for film and TV piracy. Although it received quite a lot of attention at the time in the trade press, neither the case nor the larger business of commercial print piracy, of which it was a part, feature at all in the histories of American film. So I'm using budget as a case for a single example to explore some broader historiographic implications about writing this shadow history of Hollywood. Give you some background. My first point is around film as property. By forcing research to extend outside the legitimate sphere of film culture, piracy changes not only the object but also the purpose of film historiography. Film history has adopted a range of explanatory perspectives, charting changes in the aesthetics of film, form, symptomatic readings of meaning, industry organisation, and the social practices of cinema going. In these perspectives, we see that the film occupies the status of being text and of product and of spectacle. But I want to argue that what piracy does is reorientate moving image historiography towards concerns around the film as property. For example, in January 1975, the business premises of budget films were raided as part of a widespread investigation into film and TV piracies in the LA area. At the time, Budget was operating as a licensed sub-distributor for some of the major Hollywood corporations. And in this capacity, it gave Budget access to a ready supply of legitimate film prints, which it was then selling on to overseas buyers. In the course of the raid, prints were seized, and the company and its 3 principal executives were charged with violating copyright on 3 Warner Brothers films, which were Bonnie and Clyde, Cool Hand Luke, and The Great Race, and then one of Columbia's films, On the Waterfront. The indictment alleged that the defendants, quote, were willfully and for profit vending, leasing for profit prints of said motion pictures without authorization, end of quote. Shortly afterwards, there was a revised indictment issued that was making charges on 10 counts that were covering matters of conspiracy, violating laws restricting interstate transportation of stolen goods, and criminal copyright infringement. When the case went to trial in September of 1975, the prosecution's main argument focused on alleging that Budget was breaking established industry practice by selling rather than licensing prints. For example, prints of Paper Moon were being exchanged for $275 apiece. Because Budget was selling prints overseas to exhibitors, the prosecution's argument was that defendants dealt in films that they knew to be stolen or fraudulently obtained. As the case progressed, the leading issue became whether prints could ever be sold outright, particularly for private ownership. When seeking to refute the government's case, the defence attorney Gerald M. Singer argued that the industry legitimately sold prints to individuals for private film libraries. Singer questioned prosecution witness David Begelman, who at the time was the president of Columbia Pictures, asking if he knew of anyone in the industry who kept a large film library in their home, with large being defined 6 films or more. Now, Begelman denied any knowledge of anyone who did. The actors, Robert Young and Ryan O'Neal, were also called to by the prosecution to explain how, despite their status within the industry, they were unable to buy copies of films in which they appeared. O'Neal went on to add that he'd legitimately asked Paramount for a private copy of the film Paper Moon to give to his daughter Tatum O'Neal because she'd won the Academy Award for Best Actress in the Supporting Role for her performance. O'Neal told the court that although he owned 10% of the film's gross revenues, he still was unable to get his hands on a copy. However, when actors Rock Hudson and Gene Hackman were called as defence witnesses, they gave a very different story. Hudson talked about actually his private collection of films, and Hackman described obtaining films on loan. Also testifying for the defence, Paul Frisler, who was an academic at Chapman College and at the University of California, Irvine, explained how prints were donated to educational institutions. So I think what this case shows is reading Hollywood history through piracy necessitates examining moving images as both material form, but also as intangible assets. Conventional concerns with questions of style or of meaning have become displaced around attention to property relations. And so by reimagining the object of historiographic inquiry, the film as product reorientates the purposes of film history towards interrogating how the ownership of moving images has been continually figured, reconfigured, and challenged. Second note. The film as property necessitates examining historical changes in the geospatial and network relations through which moving images circulate. During the Budget trial, it came to light that from its LA premises, Budget was supplying prints to several overseas markets, with South Africa in particular identified as the prime destination. By the start of the 1970s, South Africa was considered to be a key market for piracy, with an estimated 40 individuals or organisations supplying exhibitors with illegal copies of films that were obtained from print overruns that were being duplicated in US labs. Several factors explain why there was this growth of film and TV piracy in South Africa. First of all, in the early 60s, there had been a removal of import duty on films, and this had facilitated imports. Secondly, the unauthorised copying of films could be easily copied in South Africa, and then infringing copies were easily obtained. Third, there was this flaw in South African censorship laws that permitted the screening of uncensored versions of films in certain circumstances. Fourth, South Africa was a signatory to the Berne Convention, but not the Universal Copyright Convention. And this created the perception within the country, the perception held that the imported US films didn't enjoy copyright protection in the country. Very finally, the white minority government of the National Party in South Africa had delayed the introduction of TV out of a fear that the medium was going to undermine the control of broadcasting. And so this had created a market, quite a large market, for illegal 16mm prints to feed home entertainment. Now, although South Africa emerged as a hotbed of infringement in the 1970s, in previous decades we would have found that Britain, Germany, Italy, Turkey, Japan, India, Mexico, Yugoslavia, Poland, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union and Cuba were just some of the leading territories that were alleged to be destinations or distribution points for illegal prints of American films. Today, Ukraine, China, India, Indonesia, the Russian Federation all feature amongst the International Intellectual Property Alliance's watch list of priority countries for investigating piracy and compliance with trade agreements. In the shadow historiography of Hollywood, then, I think the changes in the organisation, topography and the extensity of unauthorised trade become combined with the spread of international piracy operations to produce what I'd like to describe as the shifting geography of piracy. Third, several histories have already traced the emergence and consolidation of US dominance across international markets for film and TV. What is missing from these accounts, however, is any attention to how piracy augments that dominance. Several commentators have noted how piracy does not necessarily challenge, but rather frequently consolidates existing cultural and economic asymmetries in international trade. This is certainly the case in the history and geography of moving image piracy, where the dominance of US culture has been equally present in legitimate and illegal markets. And I think Miguel's paper yesterday gave some figures that support that in the contemporary context. Although operating outside the legitimate media business, Budget's illegal trade was entirely dependent on existing levels of popularity enjoyed by American film and TV in overseas markets. Other films that were named in the indictment included against Budget were including Portney's Complaint, Dusty and Sweets McGee, The Way We Were, New Centurions, Dillinger, 40 Carats, The Hot Rock, and Seamus. TV programmes included Marcus Welby MD, Hawaii Five-0, Ironside, Mission Impossible, The Big Valley, Judd for the Defence, and The Doris Day Show. Historically, then, the market supremacy enjoyed by Hollywood suppliers in many overseas territories has sustained the desire of audiences to see Hollywood films and programming. But this is a desire that can be met by either legal or illegal supply. So authorised trade has had the concomitant effect of stimulating international infringement of Hollywood product. As the Budget case shows, piracy invites the need to chart an alternative history of Hollywood's overseas campaign, whereby global culture and economic influence is asserted but through illegal channels. In the historiography of piracy, the appeal of Hollywood product therefore becomes paradoxically positioned between this market dominance but also the countervailing effects of infringement. Fourth, 4 weeks after the Budget trial concluded, the guilty verdict was passed on all 10 counts. Fines were imposed on the company's 3 principal executives, with Budget's president, Albert C. Debreen, was sentenced to 3 months in prison plus 3 years probation. And news of this conviction, Jack Valenti, we were not going to have a piracy conference without mentioning Jack Valenti, president of the Motion Picture Association of America, hailed the decision as a precedent-setting verdict. Quote, "Film pirates may have had a run in the industry, but they are now on the run and will be until behind bars and put out of the filthy business of stealing and selling pictures." End of quote. But Valenti spoke too soon. 2 days before sentences were being passed down in the Budget trial, on the 1st of November 1975, Sony began marketing the first model of its Betamax video cassette recorder in the US. At the press launch for Betamax, Harvey Sheen, the president of Sony Corporation of America, unwittingly augured a future use of the VCR as a tool for infringement when he promoted the product by claiming, quote, "We're selling a Xerox for television," end of quote. How then can we understand this moment of transition in the shadow history of Hollywood film and TV? Budget was certainly representative of the print piracy business that had endured for well over 7 decades. Sentencing in the Budget trial demonstrated federal authorities partly winning their fight to contain moving image piracy. Yet the convictions in the Budget case came just as the launch of a new media technology provided the very tool for an exponential increase in infringement activity. Video cassettes introduced new infringing practices with film-to-video and video-to-video duplication. This moment was also positioned within changing systems of illegal production. While print piracy depended on specialised equipment and skills, the VCR deprofessionalised the means of illegal production and reproduction, creating a mass market for unauthorised copies. New market opportunities also emerged for distributors. Distributors created artificial scarcity by staggering the interval between the theatrical and video releasing of films, and thereby opened up a window for illegal enterprise, with cassette copies filling the gap in the market. In the US context, the Budget case came just a couple of years before implementation of the Copyright Act of 1976, which was the first major revision to US IP law in nearly 70 years. Including amongst the amendments was the first codification of the fair use provision, which later played a decisive role in paving the way for the popular adoption of the VCR by settling the lawsuit brought by Universal Studios against Sony in the Betamax dispute. So this moment of transition is a product, I think, of multiple forces. It illustrates how this historiography of moving image piracy necessitates reading across technological change, transformations in business systems for both the formal and informal economies, the emergence of new media markets, legal revision, and also changes to the spaces and practices of media consumption. Fifth and finally, I want to offer some closing thoughts on the methodological challenges that confront the historiography of media piracy. Now, piracy may be endemic to the history of media cultures, but how can we recover and know a history of a realm of cultural production that's essentially undocumented and covert? Although the budget case was something of a landmark because it was the first time in the US that criminal sentencing has been imposed for piracy, it doesn't feature in conventional histories of film or TV. When researching the case, my work was very much dependent upon reports from newspapers and trade industry trade papers, after efforts to try and recover the case file from the US National Archives at Riverside proved to be entirely fruitless. In seeking to recover this history, then journalistic sources and the paper trail of legal actions, where that's available, certainly give us something to hold on to. There are other sources that we might turn, that the historian of piracy might turn to, such as national IP statutes, international copyright treaties, research commissioned by the copyright industries for the purposes of lobbying for stricter enforcement, materials which are used in anti-piracy campaigning, and, if possible and if available, oral histories. But when we put all of this together, we'd have to ask, how possible is it to take this history beyond this institutionally authored realm of discourse? If this is what is available, then rather than claim to write history of piracy, I want to say that the truth has to be acknowledged that what is actually being written is only a history of efforts to combat piracy. Furthermore, as US copyright industries have overwhelmingly applied the greatest force in combating piracy in both their domestic and overseas territories, then what documentation is available largely tells a story from the perspective of only one set of interests. Cumulatively, these questions and these gaps in knowledge, what they reveal, they have implications for the entire project, I think, of media historiography. If piracy is present and widely practiced, it has to occupy a central and not a marginal position in the writing of media history. Yet if piracy is a realm of cultural production that's largely undocumented and unknowable, or at least is only known through certain institutional sources, then I think we have to conclude it's a necessary but ultimately lost history. Thank you. 18 and a half.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to start sitting down, and then if I feel there's not enough energy, probably from me, I'll stand up. I'm going to start sitting down. I'm going to try and start off by being a good boy, so I'm going to do what the programme told me to do. I'm going to focus on some of those objects and processes and practices in film and media studies and the study of piracy that exist besides the screen in order to address one of the conference's main aims, which is to explore new methods of research, so kind of following on from what Paul was doing. I'm not such a good boy, and the methods I'm interested in are different from the example that was provided in the information about this conference, which was media archaeology. And this is because, for all their concern with the non-human and the post-human and the post-anthropocentric and the multi-scalar logics of the Anthropocene, for me, post-theory theories like media archaeology continue to be quite humanist and liberal in approach, and I'll explain why I think that as we're going through. At the end, I'm going to point towards some of the practical pirate projects I'm involved with, which relate to screen-based media, but I'm going to begin by explaining why myself and a number of collaborators, some of whom are in the room, are interested in acting as something like pirate media theorists or pirate philosophers. So I'm going to brace yourself, I'm going to start with some philosophy. Okay, so in a 1980 interview with Le Monde, Michel Foucault insists on remaining anonymous. And he does so out of a nostalgia for a time when he was quite unknown and what he said had some chance of being heard. The effects of the book might land in unexpected places and form shapes that I'd never thought of, he said. I'm going to come back to issues of the name and attribution and anonymity with my conclusion. But there's another reason why I'm interested in this masked philosopher interview. And this concerns, it's kind of just quite a brief comment, but this concerns his remark that books, universities, and learned journals are also information media. And it's important to emphasise this fact at an event concerned with objects and processes and practices that exist besides the screen. Because as far as the majority of us are concerned, this aspect of the media is just something we're required to be involved in as part of our professional activity. So we tend to think very critically about the media in relation to cinema and games and the internet, but we don't spend too much time reflecting on the media that we use in the practice of our own research. So linearly written and organised, bound and printer paper codec books and journal articles are media we're constantly reading, writing and publishing. And I know you launched a book yesterday and this feels like it's just, and it isn't. It's everything, no, it's all of us. But as politico-institutional system of production and control, complete with its inherited disciplinary protocols of status and advancement and recognition, it's become so naturalised, it's not something we're especially willing or able to devote much critical attention to. And this is a particular issue for that area of film and media studies, which first in the US and then later elsewhere has been placed under the heading of theory. And theory continues to be important because of its ability to denaturalise and destabilise institutional disciplinary formations, including those associated with theory itself. So theories committed to challenging and changing our ways of being and doing in the world. And as David Theo Goldberg he points out, theory must therefore by necessity take on the social and thought frames themselves, the structural conditions constituting the conditions of possibility in which order and shape our established and inherited ways of being and thinking and doing. Yet for all this, much that goes under the rubric of the critical in theory assumes the frame of the conventional and given. So in that sense, theory engages overwhelmingly in thinking within the faded frame. And nowhere is theory's thinking within the faded frame more evident than the way it continues to be dominated by the printed book and journal article, together with many of the core humanities concepts that have been inherited with them. And these include the named author that we've seen, Foucault, say that makes reading too easy, but they also include the sovereign proprietorial subject, the finished object, copyright, and even the human, along with the institutions that sustain and support them, the university, the publishing house, and this nice new library at Aberdeen. Indeed, if Western philosophy has forgotten that its origins lie with techniques, as Bernard Stiegler insists, then many theorists and philosophers can also be said to have forgotten the media technologies by which their own work is not only produced and published and distributed, but also commodified, privatised and controlled by for-profit companies operating as part of capitalism's culture industries. And it's important to be aware of this for a number of reasons. The inherited, taken for granted arrangement by which most of us operate is that the theoretical ideas contained in the books and the journal articles we author, and which we see as the result of the process of research on our part, are distinct from the practical material forms that these objects take. And this is usually that of a series of pages gathered together in a coherent, numbered sequence using cloth and wood pulp-based paper, card, ink and glue, and then they're reproduced, distributed and marketed on an industrial basis as a commodity that can be privately owned and bought and sold by a publisher using a copyright all rights reserved license. And what we can see now, however, is not just that our books and journal articles are information media too, but they're part of the structural conditions that order and shape our ways of being and thinking and doing as film and media studies scholars and academics. Now, quoting Goldberg again there, but perhaps the most famous expression of this is Marshall McLuhan, who was mentioned earlier, but this is from his book, The Gutenberg Galaxy. And here the development of the print book and the associated requirement for closed-off spaces in which to read and study is presented as having played a fundamental role in the emergence of modern subjectivity, along with the associated concepts of the rational liberal individual, linear thought, rather than the kind of cloud that Oliver and Adnan gave us, critical reflection, and the public-private distinction. So the ideas we have are not separate and distinct from the material apparatus with which those ideas are physically created, published, and circulated. Rather, things and words, body and mind, language and reality, the immaterial and material are all enmeshed here, to the point where the material qualities and properties of books and journals form the preconditions for the constitutions of the ideas they carry. And this in turn has important implications for many of the core humanities concepts that have been inherited with these specific media objects, the named author, sovereign subject, copyright, and so on. For the effect of seeing books and journals and universities as information media technologies that help to constitute the ideas they contain is to decenter many of these humanities concepts and move us towards a more post-humanities ontology. So here, writing, the printed coded text, the humanities, the university, are all revealed as products of the processual and relational interactions of a heterogeneous, we can use the word thick, assemblage of humans, both conscious and multi-conscious, but also objects, non-humans and non-anthropomorphic elements too. So in the case of an ink and paper card book on the Simina, for example, and I don't have any particular book in mind, the assemblage includes its authors, their teachers, colleagues, students and peers, together with the book's publishers, peer reviewers, designers, printers, distributors, retailers, purchasers and readers, but also includes all the other connections and lines of interaction that necessarily connect the text to its many outsides. So the labour and resources used in the book's production and distribution, the minerals, the metals, plants, dyes, oils, salts, pigments, the shipping and container costs and the environmental impact, as well as the copyright license it's published under and which controls the sites through which the book can and cannot move. So a for-profit retailer such as Amazon, say, but supposedly not a shadow library such as ARG or LibGen that we've heard about. But also follows that if the material forms from which ideas are created change, then so do the ideas themselves, and with them human subjectivity and consciousness. And this is significant because for some we are currently in the process of leaving or shifting out of the Gutenberg galaxy of the book and privacy and the rational, liberal, humanist subject skilled in critical reflection. So consider, and I'm wondering where my drink is, there it is. Consider just the way that our notions of privacy are changing. We increasingly no longer require closed-off spaces in which to study print books in silence. Instead, we're reading print and other media in public on laptops, in coffee shops that resemble libraries, or in this case in libraries that kind of resemble coffee shops, particularly in that kind of background noise and their lack of books. While travelling on public transport, using mobile media that track our locations, and in online social networks that encourage us to make personal information publicly available by sharing what's happening with us, but which also judge and shame us if we make a mistake or otherwise go against social norms. But if we are moving towards what you might think of as a post-Gutenberg world, if the internet is a game changer, was pointed towards yesterday, to what extent can we understand this world by continuing to act as if we're still living very much in the Gutenberg galaxy of the established humanities, with their emphasis on the book and privacy and the rational, liberal, human subject? In other words, how can we understand cinema in the era of internet piracy and self-organised pirate or shadow libraries, together with their implications for our inherited ideas of the named author and the proprietary subject and so on, if we insist on writing linearly organised, commercially copyrighted, bound and printed papered books and journal articles about it? Now, some would say that these questions are being addressed in certain areas of the digital humanities, that the process of transitioning to a post-Gutenberg world has made the way that the material form of media objects actually actively helps to order and shape the intellectual ideas they carry, hard to ignore for many in the digital humanities. And this is why they portray humanists as needing to take advantage of the opportunities that are provided by digital technology to be much more engaged practically and theoretically with the media that they use to create and publish and circulate their research. Hence the importance that's attached to being able to write software code and generate interactive electronic literature and scholarly editions and build online journals and libraries and archives. For me, however, while I'm interested in the digital humanities, for me they tend to stay too much within the faded frame of the humanities, not least in their adherence to quite conventional ideas of the humanistic and the human, as we can see, which is why I prefer to think in terms of what you might call post-humanities. Still, we shouldn't be too hard on digital humanities. Even the most apparently radical of post-humanist and anti-humanist thinkers, including media archaeologists and new materialists, encounter this problem. They may endeavour to decenter the human from the centre of Western thought by privileging the object and the non-human and the post-human and the multi-scalar logics of the Anthropocene, as I say. But the main way that such theorists tend to do that is by writing big, masculine, linearly organised, explanatory books containing original ideas that are always attributed to them as individual named authors, to the exclusion of all other human and non-human actors on an all rights reserved or at best Creative Commons basis. So we can see that there are ways of being and doing. We were talking yesterday about the shift from representation to kind of ways of doing to what's being done. Their ways of being and doing as theorists remains resolutely humanist and liberal. So clearly, what we need to do, it's simple, don't worry about it, we need to come up with new ways of being and doing that are more appropriate to a post-Gutenberg world. Yet, as we know, that's not so simple, since there are no non-humanist and non-liberal alternatives to publishing on an all-rights reserved basis that are legally and professionally recognised. And that's kind of why I used the word monstrous in my title. For Jacques Derrida, in his perfectly legible texts, the future is necessarily monstrous. Yeah. A future that would not be monstrous would not be a future. So as media theorists, then we need to open ourselves to a future in which we do not adhere to the humanist liberal programme for creating, publishing and circulating our work. And it's here that the idea of acting something like pirate media theorists or pirate philosophers come in, or becoming hacker would be another way of thinking about it, if you like. Now, I need to stress that when I use the word pirate in my work, I'm not so much thinking of the sense of the historical romantic outsider of fiction and film, nor the kind of radical libertarianism espoused by the online drug czar Dread Pirate Roberts, nor even of the deviant thief or subversive radical associated with the pro-piracy movement. When the word pirate began to appear in the text of the ancient Greeks, it was directly related to verb, my pronunciation is terrible, paro, or to make an attempt, to try, to test. And it's here that the modern term pirate has its etymological origins. And it's this sense of the pirate as someone who tries and tests and teases and troubles that I'm drawing on. Just waiting for the photograph and then I can move on. Ready? Okay. At the same time, the reason I'm suggesting we act something like pirate philosophers is because a responsible ethical, as opposed to moral, approach wouldn't presume to know what piracy is in advance. One of the problems with the moralistic position, whether it condemns piracy or approves of it for romantic or countercultural reasons, is it too often has its basis in a paradox that lies at the heart of authority, whereby those in power attempt to define the methods of opposing them that are acceptable. And interesting, it's a paradox of authority that also applies to the neoliberal states sanctioning of contemporary privateers, those involved in the privatisation of public resources, such as the education system, health service and welfare state, an attempt to control and limit alternative appropriations of the commons, say those of Pirate Bay or Mega Upload, or those that are happening in Somalia, by condemning them as piracy. The laws and institutions by which the state condemns piracy as illegal are based on the same ambivalent structure of authority. Such capitalist lawmakers are also always undecidedly robbers or pirates too. For, as we know, as St. Augustine famously remarks, What are states and kingdoms but great robberies? Perhaps the best way to understand this paradoxical aspect of authority, however, is in relation to the legislator in Rousseau's The Social Contract. Here too, we can never know whether the legislator, the founder of a new law or institution, such as a university or a journal, or a new way of being or a new way of condition of life, such as being a different condition of life for a media theorist, such as that Oliver and Adnan were pointing to, you can never be sure whether they're legitimate or a charlatan. And the reason for this is the aporia that lies at the heart of authority, whereby, in order to be able to found it, the legislator or lawmaker already has to possess the authority that the founding of the new institution is supposed to provide him or her with. So you already have to have that institution in order to found an institution, all that authority. So certain so-called internet pirates, such as the Pirate Bay and ARG or Aaron Swartz, we could argue, are in a similar situation. They too may be involved in performatively inventing and trialling and testing the very new laws and institutions by which their activities may be judged and justified. So might acting something like pirate philosophers in this sense be a transformative gesture, as we heard about yesterday, with the potential to lead to new non-humanist and non-liberal ways of creating, publishing and circulating film and media studies information media, ways that are more appropriate to the late age of print than books and journal articles. It's this question that myself and a number of collaborators are exploring in a series of practical, you might call pirate projects. For reasons of time, I'm only going to mention one of them, though. There's quite a few, and that's just some of them. And this is an experiment I embarked on a few years ago now to investigate some of the implications of so-called internet piracy for ideas of the named author and anonymity and copyright. And that I did that through the creation of an actual, if you like, called pirate text. So the project is, I published a text called Pirate Philosophy in the online journal Culture Machine, how it was available there for a limited period only. After 2 months, it was taken down, placed on a torrent and directory, and the original deleted from the Culture Machine site. So as soon as someone downloaded the torrented version, don't take a photo of that, there's only 2 people looked at that particular one. As soon as someone downloaded the original torrented version, I destroyed the original version of the file. So there's now no original version of this text in the conventional sense. It only exists in the sense of it's part of a pirate network and is pirated. So from that date onwards, all copies of this text have been pirate copies and available for anyone to not only read and download and copy and share without charge, but they can rewrite, remix and reuse it. And as I said, the idea behind the project is to raise questions around the named author, copyright and so on. And to do this not just in our writing, what I'm writing about, but in our ways of being and doing as media theorists. For example, what does it mean to now publish a copy of this text in a book or an edited collection? Having destroyed the original version, the only version that can be published is a pirated copy that has been circulated and potentially authored and edited anonymously. How does that affect our ideas of the named author, of scholarly writing and publishing, of copyright, of the university professor that Ginny started out with? Now, interestingly, this emphasis on plastic, fluid, processual nature of text and authorship that some of us are experimenting with has a clear connection to this understanding of the piracy of the ancient Greeks. For pirates traditionally operate on liquid, the sea. And indeed, the association with sea and fluidity is one reason pirates historically have not been treated as legitimate human opponent. In The Enemy of All, Daniel Heller Rosen shows that to be counted with within what the Roman philosopher Cicero terms the immense fellowship of the human being, you're required to belong to a community tied, like the Roman polity, to a clearly delimited territory on land. If you don't do this, if you have a more fluid life, whether in terms of the sea or liquidity or process or on the focus on being and doing, focus on doing rather than being, then you're at risk of being considered a pirate. This being one name for those who cannot be treated as proper human adversaries. But if we're interested in experimenting with new ways of being and doing as media theorists, new conditions of life that are not simply humanist and liberal, might taking the risk of being considered monstrous as a result of acting something like pirate philosophers offer us one way of doing so? Isn't this the kind of chance we need to take for our work to be less easy to read and to have a chance of landing in unexpected places and form shapes that we've never thought of. Thanks very much.